look, I get this was a very, very serious episode, a lot of very heady topics, but really, I just have to say, I'm so excited they brought back the weird, star legal pins from the episode Court Martial. I adore it! God, I'm such a fucking nerd. Hello, interwebs! I am here to review the second episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2, this one titled Ad Aspera per Astra? Something like that. Latin-y Starfleet nonsense. Anyways, I am so freaking excited to talk about this episode. And as per usual, I'm going to stay spoiler-free up front, and then I'll get into spoilers in just a little bit, and I'll give you a warning when I do that. But the spoiler-free section is going to be short because everybody, I have so many notes on this episode because this episode was so freaking good. Legitimately, hands down, this might be not only my favorite episode of this series, but might be one of the best episodes of modern Star Trek and Star Trek generally. Just to be very clear, again, staying spoiler-free here, this is the episode that is dealing with the fallout from the cliffhanger from Season 1, with Una being arrested for being an Illyrian and a genetically modified person, which is illegal in the Federation after the eugenics wars. So sort of going off into that, this is that episode that is basically a courtroom drama, very much in the style of the original series episode Court Martial, and even more so in episodes like Measure of a Man and Drumhead. And when I say those two episode names, that should just set off a spark in any Star Trek fan's head, because both Drumhead and Measure of a Man, especially Measure of a Man, are two of the best episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek overall. And in fact, Measure of a Man is my favorite Star Trek episode just overall. I literally did a list a few months ago where I said exactly that. And this episode stands up right alongside them. And the reason that I love this episode so much was that it is very clear in understanding the dynamics that it is playing with. The idea of this episode is trying to discuss when is a law just or not, and can a law exist that is not just in a society that is not built to recognize everyone's, for lack of a better word, humanity. And it understands that is what it wants to attack and go after, about when is a law not just, and what does that mean, and how can we talk about systemic harm being built into the foundations of a culture and a society and a government. But it also understands that this is a legal episode. And so what I loved this episode so much for was that while it had these greater aspirations, it wasn't about tearing down the Federation, because ultimately that would be unrealistic in terms of a single courtroom drama. It understands that this is an episode about the legal framework that you use to build to start to push for that systemic change. I say this as someone who is very much a leftist, in the very much sense that I am about let's tear down the system, fuck systems that are not built for people. Star Trek is never going to be that, at least in terms of when it's the Federation show. It's going to be a show about how do you work within a system that will hopefully aim to always do better and hopefully grow. And it's not perfect, but it will work to do the systemic change to better people. And so if we understand that that's what Star Trek is going to be, a much more liberal take, and when I say liberal, I don't mean neoliberal capitalist, I mean more in the sense of it being liberal in the sense of it believes in the power of the system to change over time. And this episode is one that recognizes that and says look, this is how this happens, this is how you can do that, and this is how you understand the legal framework for that. And so while I am very much someone tear down the system, let's destroy it because it doesn't help us all, this episode, I think, in terms of that framework of using the Federation and Starfleet and Star Trek as an ideal to strive for, and a system that can work to better itself for those that it maybe sometimes pushes off to the side, this is the best way to do that. And I love the nuances of all of that. And then inside all of that, and I have so many notes, y'all, of this, there's so many nuances within the discussion that it has of these people who have privilege within society, even while also being harmed at the same time. It is just a wonderful discussion of all of that. And I have to commend this episode, because I'm going to be reviewing this off the cuff, but I can tell you right now, I can write a whole essay, and probably will at some point, about this episode and all of the things that it does, because frankly, there is so much to dive into here. It is ridiculous how nuanced it is. So let's dive in and let's talk about it in spoilers. All right, the best way I'm going to be able to go through this is I'm going to go through this scene by scene and just talk about some of the nuances in it. But oh boy, I'm going to say I'm probably going to miss a few things that I want to discuss because there's so much here. And we're just going to go quickly because I am so freaking excited about this episode. We start off the episode with a flashback to young Una. We see that she has an injury on her leg and her parents are worried about her because she may not be okay, and we don't know why yet. They're not taking her to a doctor, but we will learn later on in this episode. So establishing that there's this fear around who she is because of who she is, and her leg sort of glows as it's healing, something we saw in season 1. But then we go into Captain Patel, who is the sort of prosecutor in Una's case, talking to Una about a plea deal that they're basically giving her, saying, hey, if you plead guilty to this, we will give you a dishonorable discharge, but you'll still be allowed to live as a Federation citizen. And obviously Una is hurt by this because it is her saying that we're going to sort of sweep your career under the rug. All the stuff that you did, all the good that you did, we're just kind of not going to acknowledge it. But Starfleet, what Una doesn't really realize here, they have an ulterior motive because they don't want to reveal that Una got in and was a good officer, because it would like kind of look bad on their prejudices. And so they're trying to sweep it under the rug so they don't have to acknowledge it. And I love this, but they're putting the shame on her when really the shame is Starfleet's. And I like that they're offering this plea deal and making it seem like this is the best deal you can get, when no, Una's the one who is in the right here for being who she is. And I love that little nuance there. It's like, oh, there's such a smart like understanding of how the system makes people feel shame and feel like it's their fault for being the problem, and puts it on them and how they need to take the burden of that, when it's really the system trying to protect itself. Love it! We then have Pike just doing like awesome ally behavior. Like Pike, A+ ally. He is an ally and accomplice, because I love this opening bit where he goes to this Illyrian planet where they can all live with their genetic modifications easily, but he can't because he's a human. And he just like straight up goes like, I will die here in this waiting room if you don't see me. Just straight up accomplice behavior. We stan Pike here. We love this man. Perfect ally, no notes. And I love his meeting with Naru, who is sort of the lawyer that will take on Una's case here, and him trying to convince her to take the case. One thing I love, first off, she is called a civil rights lawyer. The episode is being very clear about what this story is about. This is about civil rights. Like, no beating around the bush of it. She's a civil rights lawyer. That's her job. No, like, Captain Riker having to become the lawyer for an episode. No, this is an actual civil rights lawyer who is taking on this job. No JAG officers or anything. So I love that they call out civil rights lawyer. And I'm just going to say this right here. Naru, straight fire this whole episode. Everything that she had to say, everything. I'm just like, I love this woman. She is freaking perfect. Adore her. She is straight, like, take no nonsense. Screw you, and I see your prejudice for what is Starfleet. But I also understand the law and I'm willing to work within it to get what I need done. And I love this lady. Every speech she has is great. And I love that she calls out Pike and says, like, Starfleet is a prejudicial organization and I hate it so much. And Pike sort of tries to fight that by saying, look, I see the light. And if I can see the light, if I'm someone who believes in the Federation so much, but I can see what's going on here is wrong, maybe you have the potential to make that be shown to everybody. And that starts to get her. Doesn't fully get her, but then Pike pulls out this other card where he says, look, I know you want to have a chance to fight this system because you've been trying to fight this for a while, but all your cases get dismissed. Una has a case that you can actually do right now, and it might actually help further these other cases. You might be able to set some legal precedent. We'll come out to that idea of legal precedent in a little bit, because, oh boy, do I have very excited thoughts about that and how that's handled. But yes, so that is all stuff that he uses to convince her, and I love this discussion because it feels just perfect for both of them and how he uses it to convince her to take on Una's case. Then we get a scene with Una and Naru, who takes on Una's case, and we get a sense that there's some history here between the two of them, which we'll get more later on, but they sort of have a little bit of anger at each other. And I love Naru here, again, just woman is straight fire, just like calling out Una's like, you have, essentially, she basically says she has passing privilege, saying you were able to pass as a human and could lie on your application and say that you were human to be able to get into Starfleet. And Naru says, some people can't pass, some people, like myself, don't wish to pass. And while this isn't a straight one-for-one, this like reads to me very much as a trans person, because one thing, if you're not trans, that happens within the trans community is there's this thing called passing privilege, where there are trans people who can look like they are cisgender, not transgender, and that allows them to feel a little bit safer in certain spaces. That does not mean those trans people who do have what is called passing privilege do not face any discrimination or any hatred, nor that it is their quote-unquote fault or something wrong that they are passing, but it does allow them sometimes a little bit of safety in spaces that other trans people who are more visually identifiably as trans will maybe face discrimination for. And so that is something that she's sort of calling out Una for taking advantage of without using that privilege to then stand up further for her community. Because there's something that you talk about when you talk about sort of community standing in solidarity. It's those people who have more privilege in a situation as part of the community should use that privilege to be able to stand up for those in their community reality and use it to fight for them. And it sucks because you can understand Una's point of view too, where it's like, I just wanted to care about myself and live my own life. I didn't want to have to take on this fight. I just wanted to exist, and she has every right to do so. But there's also an understandable resentment of someone within a community being like, you didn't stand up for us because this fight is all of our fights, and we need to show solidarity for each other. So it's one of those, like, you understand where both of them are coming from. It's not like anyone's evil in that situation, but I very much am on the side of Naru being like, you should use this privilege that you have to be able to stand up for your community. And Naru is now being like, I can take advantage of that moment here to be able to fight for people who need it. And I'm going to use this chance to do it my way. And Una listens to her and talks to her about that. And I think that's, again, the nuances of this beats are so good. And the language that this episode uses is very specific, like the word passing. And it does not mean it's relating one-to-one for trans people, because this is pulling from a lot of civil rights issues, and we'll talk about a little bit later. It's not one-for-one with like queer or trans issues specifically, but they use a lot of the language of different groups throughout history who have been discriminated against by, systems that they live within to discuss all of this. And it's just so well done. So well done. We then have a quick scene between Batel and Pike, where Batel is angry at Pike for having convinced Una to take on this new lawyer who turned down the deal. And Pike's like, yeah, no, it's good. She deserves to fight this fight. She should be on my bridge. And it sort of causes a rift in their relationship, and saying, like, look, she might get charged with sedition because of this now. You might have made things worse for her. And sort of a complicated feeling on Pike's part, because if this gamble doesn't pay off, it may have made Una's life worse than what it would have been otherwise. So I like this sort of setup of like Pike's like, oh shoot, did I do the wrong thing by trying to make the moral stance rather than the pragmatic one. So great discussion there. We then have a quick little discussion between Una and Naru, talking about Admiral April coming to the stand, and I like them sort of having this argument. It's like, look, you don't want to go on the stand because you could not only potentially perjure yourself, or if you don't, you may put your friend Pike in the line of fire because he knew who you were before you were arrested, so that could make him also face charges as well. So it's dangerous to do that. So we need to talk to April, and April may be using this as a chance to be used against you. Whereas Una sort of hopes that April can be a character witness, someone that can speak to how well she's done as an officer. But obviously that's not going to be the case one for one. But then we get a quick little scene between La'an and Naru, where La'an sort of offers this idea of like, well, what if they got the information that Una is an Illyrian illegally? Would that be able to be to dismiss the case? And Naru rightfully says, like, yeah, if we got that information, that would allow us to dismiss the case because they obtained the evidence illegally. And I listened to this, and I'm like, okay, that is a way that they could win the case. I hope this is not how they actually do it, because that would be winning on a technicality. And I think that this episode had a much stronger way of going about it if it was actually pointing out like, hey, this is a problem with the Federation. So if they wanted a technicality, it wouldn't ultimately do anything in terms of addressing the underlying issue. So I heard this story and I'm like, I really hope this isn't how they win. And thankfully that's not the direction they go. But I like that it being brought up that there were ways to win on a technicality, but it is not the way that they were going to go. Then a quick little scene between Pike and Batal, where Batal sort of points out to Pike, like, look, we could have you on the stand, we could have you be a character witness, but then you may have to reveal that because you're on the stand and you don't wish to perjure yourself, that you knew about this earlier and you could implicate yourself. So I like that, her pointing out this point. It's like, yes, you could be a character witness, you could speak for her, you could, give the great Pike speech, but it might blow back in your face and hurt you both. And so it sort of has Pike sort of having to sit on the sidelines and be able to do nothing, which is an awkward place for Pike, because Pike is a man of action. Pike likes to do things, and now he just has to sit back and watch. And I like that this is a place that Pike is not used to being in, and it makes him uncomfortable, because the letter of the law said that he did wrong as well. So I love that. There's also a fun quick little comedy scene with Ortegas and Mbenga sort of watching Spock and this Batel guy, who is the sort of Vulcan admiral who is sort of leading the prosecutor's case. And I just love them, like, do you not sense the tension there? These Vulcans are angry at each other, and Spock's like, oh, I'm sorry, you had to see that outburst. I was laughing as hell at that. And also kind of show that there are Vulcan dynamics. And I like that they're building up this Vulcan lawyer guy as an asshole. And we'll sort of get to him a little bit later. But then we have a quick little scene between La'an and Uhura, and I also loved this sequence, because La'an sort of asks Uhura to try to break privacy and find out how they got Una's information about why she's Illyrian, and Uhura says no. And it's then that's the end of it. I love that because what I was worried about is that there was going to be a scene where La'an says, all right, I'll go around to Uhura, break Uhura's trust in order to try to get this information. But Uhura's right, you do not breach privacy. And I love her making that stand and it causing La'an to reassess and say, I can't get this information. That it wasn't like La'an going rogue. And it was about like, no, we do not break moral boundaries in order to try and help someone else, even if it's the moral thing to help them. So it was just a great, like, no, we do not cross these boundaries, even if it means we are trying to defend our friend, to do the right thing there. I just loved again, it's just another way that this episode understands that, like, there are lines that you don't cross in certain battles, and I really like that. I thought that was great. But then we get the trial beginning, and we get I love the aesthetics of all this. They very much pulled from the episode Court Martial from the original series for the uniforms. The uniforms are all sexy and wonderful. I love it. My original series heart was freaking out at that. But even more importantly, we set up the ideological battle that is going on here between the prosecution and the defense. And the prosecution's argument is that, the law says that it's illegal for an genetically modified person to work in Starfleet. And that comes out of the eugenics wars. We have this fear of the eugenics wars that did cause an attempted genocide by someone like Khan. And so we are very rightfully worried about that. And the one phrase that stuck out to me that was interesting was this idea of natural evolution that the prosecution brings up. And that phrase held particular relevance to me because a lot of the ways that persecution and prejudice and bias and ultimately discrimination and bigotry forms from is this idea that there is a natural and normal way to be. That there is a better, like, sort of more ingrained natural form of oneself. That trans people are unnatural because we have surgeries sometimes in order to make ourselves more comfortable with our body. That, being gay is unnatural, an aberration. That being, a different race, being, black is a sort of lesser form of being human, or Jewish people are, against God, and God is natural law. So, a lot of bigotry stem from this argument of, like, there's a natural way to be. And so that phrase sort of stuck out to me that this episode used it in a very intriguing way to argue against Una. So I loved that was a phrase used because it was evoking all of this. And then this brings us to the defense's argument, Natal's argument, which is quite literally that, like, the law is not just. Just because something is a law does not make it right. And this law was ingrained in Federation society, was built into its constitution, into the Articles of the Federation, because of this trauma that they experienced, but ultimately it was, turn into prejudice. And so I like this idea that this prejudice has been systemically built into Federation society, that it is a systemic problem. It's not just individual biases and prejudices, it is a systemic problem built into the Federation's very legal framework that she is going to be arguing against. And I loved that is what this sort of argument was hinging upon. Do we follow the letter of the law? Do we understand that the law is not just? Because the law can be used to enshrine bigotries in society. That goes all the way back to, throughout history. But here in American society, we can see, like, quite literally in the Constitution, they literally said that black people were 3/5 of a human being. That is enshrined in our Constitution. Thankfully, done away with, but, like, there's a lot of the foundation of what America is built on this foundation of enshrining slavery and the dehumanization of black people into our Constitution. And a lot of our institutions are built out of that and becomes a systemic problem. While individual bigotries can thrive from that, and encourage, and the system encourages that generally, that these bigotries are built into the system, and that's what she's fighting. So I love that is what this is targeting. And then we get April on the stand. And what, everyone hopes Naru is going to do is use him as a character witness for Una. And later on, after all this is done, when there's a scene between Pike and April, he literally says, I wish I had gotten the chance to be a character witness for Una. But Naru is very smart here, because what she is doing, while she knows that she might push it too far and get his testimony tossed out, what she is pointing out here when she interrogates April is that, like, he is willing to put aside the law when it suits the moment, when there's a moral and ethical choice to be made. And he will break the prime directive because it's the right thing to do at that moment. So him sort of saying, well, I wouldn't have let Una in because if I had known she was Illyrian because it was the legal thing. She points out, it's like, but you would break the law if it was the right thing to do. So why wouldn't you do it in Una's case? And the reason is because he has prejudice against her. He has prejudice against who she is because of his own presupposed biases, based on, how Federation society has taught him to view genetically modified people. And I loved that. And again, it gets tossed out, but she's making a very clear point that, that there is bigotry. She's establishing that there is individual bigotry in this society stemming from using the law as a framework to obfuscate it. And that is such a smart starting place that she is building from. And people are angry at Naru for doing so because they thought, it would probably be better if you just have him be a character witness. But she doesn't need him because she's going to use the Enterprise crew later as character witnesses. So I thought this is such a smart way for her to start. This does, though, bring us to a conversation between Una and Batal, which, again, I really, really loved, because Una, again, calls this out as like, you could have used April as a character witness. Why were you going after him? That this shouldn't have been about him. And she's like, no, it's not about him, but I'm trying to point out this problem. And what ultimately Una is arguing here is that Naru was being aggressive when she shouldn't have been. She should have just let him go by. And it's like, Naru is making this point about, like, you need to be aggressive in uncovering this. You can't make them feel comfortable, because comfortability is what lets this sit and become invisible, because they make them feel comfortable when you don't address it. So she has to come across aggressive in order to point it out. And Una is brushing up against that. And also, Una also says that Naru is using this to further her own agenda. She's saying that Naru is being selfish. Quite literally, she's being selfish. And Naru pushes back against that too and says, no, I'm not being personally selfish. I am using, and she uses the word privilege, I'm using your privilege because you are able to pass in this society to defend the people that are not able to pass in society, who cannot hide themselves, who have to face the discrimination in a way that you didn't have to. And I want to be very careful in how I say this, but I think this is a very important dynamic going on in the scene, especially in terms of how they cast these characters. This is a black woman saying this to a white woman in this situation. And one thing that you often find when you talk about how black women are viewed in our society in America today is black women are often viewed as selfish, narcissistic, and aggressive for often just speaking up about issues that affect them and affect other, discriminated against people. And the reason that they are viewed that way is because often they have to make people feel uncomfortable to point out why these prejudices exist and why they are enshrined in our society. And so a black woman, even just existing in a space, makes people uncomfortable because it makes them understand why the system isn't built for them. But then they put that cognitive dissonance onto the black person. And I will not say this is an exact one for one because there's a much different dynamic between race and gender discrimination within our society today. But I also have something that I feel as a trans person, and queer people also feel to a degree. We are seeing this a lot with trans people today, in that trans people are often, when we speak up about our issues, about how we are being harmed and discriminated against today in society, we are often seen as aggressive, narcissistic, being uncivil when we point out this discussion. And so I think for this episode, to have a black woman saying this to a white woman, saying, I am going to use your privilege to be able to fight this fight for people who don't have that privilege, and you're going to say that I look aggressive and selfish for doing so, that is another prejudice that you're putting upon me when I am just trying to fight this fight for, discriminated against people. And I love that dynamic. There's so much nuance to discuss within all of that, that I could write a whole essay on just that scene alone, because it is so good. Right down to the casting decisions. From here, then, we do get the character witnesses, where all the crew of the Enterprise sort of speak highly of Una, speak up for her. There's some fun little bits in here where La'an sort of says, I always believed in her, other people wouldn't be alive. I love the Gilbert and Sullivan reference to the Short Trek we hear with Spock, which was really, really fun. Going back to the episode Q&A from Short Treks, that was great.
I am the very model of a modern major general. I have information, vegetable, animal, and mineral.
But then we have a quick little scene between La'an and Atal, which is also fan-frickin-tastic, because La'an comes forward and says, look, I thought it was me who was the one who revealed Una because I was angry at her, and I felt that she lied to me, and that's why I was upset. But Naru sort of points out the real truth to the matter. It's like, you have this history with genetic modifications because of your lineage from Khan, Nooney, and Singh. And because of that, you are a bit of a self-hating, what I read it as is sort of like a self-hating gay. It is sort of an equivalent. Not exactly the same, but like a self-hating gay person. And I love Naru sort of pointing out this fact. It's like, her line was quite literally like, they look down at us for so long that we begin to look down at ourselves. And that is something that many discriminated against people feel. I feel it as a trans person, as a gay person for a lot of my life for a very long time, because I knew that our society looked down on queer people, trans people, that it made me feel like I was lesser for being queer and being trans. But that is not the truth. That is society making me feel and internalize that, when that isn't actually the truth, because it has been so ingrained in our society and how we exist around each other. And so I thought that was such a great speech by Naru, and saying, you are not a monster. You are a person who has a capacity for good or for ill, just like anyone else. And it was such a beautiful speech, probably one of my favorite moments of the episode, and it clearly affected La'an. I thought that was very, very wonderful. And one thing that I haven't mentioned here too, that, you know, is clearly a parallel throughout this whole episode, is don't ask, don't tell, is a very clear equivalency that this episode is kind of judging on going for, where if you don't remember, don't ask, don't tell was this policy created by Clinton where gay people could serve in the military, but they just weren't allowed to be open about it. If they were open about it, then they would get dishonorably discharged from the military. And this seems like a compromise, but that is not a good compromise. It means that gay people still have to feel like they have to hide themselves. And if they are outed by anyone, even out from no choice of their own, they can be thrown out and lose their whole careers. It was a disgusting compromise, and it wasn't a good one at all. But it was this very like centrist view of it, and so that's a lot of what this episode is sort of drawing from here, and it sort of goes to like the self-hating part of a lot of this as well. Again, not one for one. I think there's a lot more dynamics going on beyond just the don't ask, don't tell element of this episode, but it's something clearly being pulled upon with this episode. But then we get to what is easily the most, I think, didactic and very confronting scene of the entire episode that is very clear in a lot of the language and imagery it is evoking. And that is Una going on the stand and talking about her history as an Illyrian, facing prejudice within Federation society. The things that she describes are very clearly pulling from imagery from a lot of discriminated against groups. And a lot of the things that she just offhandedly mentions point to larger systemic problems. Like, for example, she talks about how her family had to hide their culture when they came to the Federation. This is what a lot of cultures often feel like they have to do when they join a society that does not view their culture with any sort of care or desire to incorporate it in. Many cultures feel like they have to assimilate. You know, one of the things we hear a lot with American, immigrants who come to America is that they try to assimilate into American culture, sort of get rid of a lot of their cultural signifiers, or have to hide them so they weren't seen as other by society, because they would be viewed as less than. The next thing that we hear is that when anyone is visibly from another group, they will be discriminated against. Quite literally, Una describes someone from her culture having like discriminatory words painted on their homes. That is a hate crime, and you see it a lot. You see anti-Semitic stuff being drawn on synagogues and things like that. That is an absolute hate crime to make people feel unsafe and unwelcome, just by basis of who they are. And one thing she points out in this moment that Una says is that this happened because kids were doing it to each other because they learned that prejudice in school. She says, we learned about augments earlier that year, and the opinion on augments was very, very clear. It points to how education and a lot of different systems in our society can ingrain these prejudices into people just by how they are framed and taught. We talk about, queer people, for example, in certain states in the United States as abominations, as ugly, different. You talk about Florida, don't say gay, where you're not allowed to talk about LGBTQ issues. And it's seen as this shameful thing to not discuss that's enshrined in law. And so it shows how these prejudices are learned, but how they are not benign, even in children. And so it just speaks so well to that, and just an offhanded mention, but so important. But then she literally goes even further about how they were persecuted, and they were literally, people being beaten up in the streets. They literally had ghettos formed where a city was split in two, like being very clear about, like, look at the ghettos that, people were put into. Clearly evoking many different imageries. The ghettos that Jewish people were put into in, the early Nazi Germany before they were sent off to concentration camps. All of these things. And it shows that the Federation is not a system, not a society that is working to enable these people to exist, but instilling prejudice that is enshrined in law and made invisible by the system, but then goes off on these people. And talk about Una almost dying because she didn't feel like she could go to a doctor because it would reveal who she was to others, and they would either discriminate against her, they wouldn't give her good treatment, or ruin her life later on. And because she almost dies, like discrimination in medicine, very, very clear here. But then it goes back to passing privilege, and she she reveals and she sort of takes on the acknowledgement that her family chose to live in the Federation because they could pass as Federation citizens. And that's something that Naru could not do. And so in this sequence, she's kind of publicly apologizing to Naru. And I really love that moment being like, yeah, I didn't realize that I should have stood up for my community. I should not have just sort of like tried to assimilate and pass, but I should have stood up and said, this is wrong. And so that is a really great moment. But then she talks about how she believes that Starfleet could be better. Starfleet was this system that, she thought she could find salvation within, and be a part of something greater because these people were fighting for something greater. And that goes to something that I'll talk about in just a moment. But we get to the next moment where the Vulcan prosecutor stands up and is like, nope, letter of the law, we just need to do the law. And then he also gets her to reveal that Pike knew about this, and so implicating Pike and putting him in danger as well. And Vulcan's point of view is like, yes, we follow the letter of the law. Yes, all this emotional stuff is good, but we have to follow the law. The law says that this is the thing to do. And that's ultimately going to be the case with this legal battle. Because the one thing when you're talking about laws is the people who are, the judges in this case are talking about, whether or not something is legal or not. And within the framework that has been set up here by the Federation, enshrined all the way back in the Articles of the Federation, there's no legal precedent yet to say, hey, this is a wrong thing. That there's no legal precedent to say, like, you can talk about Illyrians being persecuted against, but, there's no law that says that, it's a problem, so there's nothing you can really do in this situation. You just have to determine and interpret the law. That's all, the prosecutors can do. This is not the executive branch that makes the laws. This is the branch that just interprets the laws, and there's nothing to say that we can do anything different. But then, this is where I love this episode so much, even more so. Naru flips this on her head and reveals, hey, look, there is another law that says, hey, Una was seeking asylum. And if by entering Starfleet, because she faced persecution. The fun bit of that is that the persecution she was facing was from Federation society. So she was seeking refuge from the very society that was persecuting her within a system in that society. So she's sort of like using the law to sort of do this thing where it says, she was looking for asylum, and they can then use that as a basis to legally say, look, yes, she is okay because she was seeking asylum. We can dismiss these charges because she was seeking asylum. But what is so freaking smart of this episode, and this happens after the scene, because I'll talk a little bit of dynamics in the scene, but something that's very important is I was worried that this scene would be saying, you created the law, you sort of use this like technicality law to say like, okay, we can let her off the hook. But what Naru is doing, and what the episode points out in a minute by saying this is a start, this is not the end game, this is the start, and it can be used later on. What this does is it creates a legal precedent that says that legally the Federation has been discriminating against Illyrians. Because the thing that Naru has been fighting in other cases, my assumption would be here, other cases are people saying, hey, I was discriminated by the Federation. But there's no law that says that's illegal. There's no basis in law that says it's illegal that Illyrians have been prejudiced against in Federation society. What this decision does is by having it say that Una can seek asylum from Federation society for the discrimination faced in Federation society, it now says that there is a legal proceeding that has the assumption that the Federation is a prejudicial society against Illyrians. So now what Naru can do is go to those other cases and say, hey, I want to point to this case of Starfleet versus Una and say, this case had the precedent that said these people are discriminated against in Federation society. That is a legal basis to argue from that then she can use to then argue these other cases that saying, hey, look, this court, the Starfleet court, said that this is discrimination. Thereby, this is discrimination, then we can sort of like have that legal framework going forward. So what this case does is it's not going to tear down the Federation system. It's not going to destroy it, but it does create a legal precedent that then allows Naru to argue for the civil rights of others from this point. And this is what Naru was trying to do with Una. She wasn't trying to tear down the system. She wasn't trying to destroy all of the laws, but she was trying to create a legal precedent to create that systemic change. And this is ultimately where I think like I probably have a different political outlook on what this this episode does, because again, as a leftist, I'm someone like, tear down the system. The system is not going to be built for everyone. We need to create a new one. But within Star Trek is this universe where we have hope that this is a system and a society that can do better, that tries to do better, that will ultimately change for the better. You know, it's not something that's going to stagnate. It's going to always push itself to do better. And so this episode ending on like, yes, systemic change is possible, is I think something that Star Trek is always going to say. And so I love that this hopeful version of systemic change coming out of this legal precedent is present in this episode, and the episode understands that this is not the tearing down of the society, but it is a way to start that ball rolling, and it acknowledges that in a really cool way that I thought was so smart. And I love Naru's speech about how, you know, this is an ideal that we live up to. Laws are not, you know, the end all be all. They are things that we use as guideposts to you know, be our better selves. So be your better selves and make this choice now. And by calling to that, she creates a legal precedent, and it's beautiful. I loved this, and then the rest of the episode is just sort of icing on the cake, where, you know, there's apology between Una and Naru. They sort of reconcile. The rest of the crew gets to accept Una there. Naru sort of says, like, it's great to see people willing to serve under an Illyrian, and there's no prejudice, there's no bias. It's just like they're proud to serve under her, and it's just really, really beautiful. So I've already ranted a lot about this episode. It's probably my longest review of the season because there's just so much to say, but this episode was just so dense with so many cool things, and I absolutely adored it and loved it because of all the nuance that it brought. Legitimately, this might be one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek. Definitely in the modern era, for sure. I'm not even questioning that at this point, but it might be up there in the annals of some of my favorite Star Trek episodes of all time. This is phenomenal. And I will end there. What did you think about this episode? I would love all your thoughts down in the comments below. But beyond all of that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and freaking prosper.